Great. Okay. So thank you for everyone who came today. So we have Julie, but I'm sure that we'll have some other people who watch this recording later on. So thank you guys. Real quick, just wanted to introduce Paul McGuigan. He is a registered nurse and a certified diabetes care education specialist at Rainbow Babies and Children's Hospital. He's worked in the Pediatric Endocrinology and Metabolism division at Rainbow since the mid-90s. In nursing school at Ursuline College, he began working as a clinic assistant at Camp Ho Mita Koda on our medical team and spent 5 summers working at camp, one of which he was the camp director. Since then, he's been involved in camp for over 30 years and currently sits on the board of directors. He's been involved in clinical research since 1986. And during his time at Rainbow, he has coordinated and participated in many research studies for diabetes and other endocrine disorders. And he just had his 39th diaversary in March of this year. So happy diaversary. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Paul, and I am going to share my screen so that we can see the PowerPoint.
Okay. Okay, thanks, Sarah. So thinking about presenting this, there's a lot of different aspects of nursing, and there's a lot of different tiers of nursing, of research, I mean. And so I kind of wanted to gear this to an audience of, families of kids with diabetes who might be relatively new, so it's pretty basic. And also, I, wanted to keep it kind of simple. You can get a college degree, you can get a master's degree in research nowadays. It hasn't always really been that way, but now, research has really taken off as far as a career is concerned. If somebody would have told me 40 years ago that I would be making my career in any kind of medical research, I would have probably told them that they were crazy, but things happen. So go ahead, Julie. Julie, go ahead, Sarah. I'll give my objectives in the next slide. I think, okay. So basically, I just want to talk about the basic definitions and terms of medical research, differentiate the aspects of nursing research that families and children of diabetes may encounter, hopefully helping make a more informed decision on participation. Add some personal research experiences, both personally and professionally, that I have been involved in. Next slide. So these are just the basic, Webster's definitions of nursing. Pretty simple: careful and diligent search, studious inquiry or examination aimed at the discovery or interpretation of new knowledge, and the collection of information about a particular subject. Again, keeping it very basic and simple. Next slide, please. So in research, in medical research, we kind of joke about this as far as the acronyms that we use. And so in our glossary, I started off with acronyms because, I'll probably use a few as the talk goes on. But simply, it's just a short name, because some of these studies have these incredibly long names, especially when you're working on a pharmaceutical study. They can be, 40 or 50 words in the title. So you take a couple of the letters out of the title and make your own acronym. And some of them can get quite clever, and people have contests as to who can come up with the most clever acronym for their study, and then they give a little prize to whoever wins. So it's kind of a thing that we do. We're going to talk about assent and consent. Those are just the agreements that we use. We're going to talk about 2 different types of research that we use in medical research, clinical and observational research studies. We're going to talk about control and experimental, randomization, placebo. Those are all things that a lot of our medical research studies include, not all of them. And then we'll kind of combine which clinical ones use randomization and so on and so forth. And sponsors. The sponsor is incredibly important because that's who is going to fund your research. You can't do research without funding, and it is also the entity that will take full responsibility of all the conduct done in a research study. So they're ultimately responsible for everything. Some other terms: longitudinal, that just means a study that extends over a period of time. I'll talk about a personal study that I've been in for 38 years as of today. Ironically, I had a research study visit of a study that I've been involved in for 38 years as a participant, and my annual study happened to be today. The cohort, that's just the research participants enrolled in a certain study. Sometimes you can have, one or two cohorts in a study, and sometimes you can have tens of thousands. And so, it's just basically a conglomeration of research participants in a study is a cohort. Trial has the same meaning as studies. Some studies are called trials. Some trials are called studies. Those are interchangeable words. Power. So that's basically what gives your research its notoriety and also its power, just like that. So you have to have the correct number of participants and the right amount of data in order to power your study to make sure that it's meaningful and that it's publishable and that people will read it and hopefully will do what you set out to do, and that's to use your information for clinical practice. That's the ultimate goal here. A consortium is a conglomerate of sites. So a lot of times when we're doing studies, we know that we can't get enough power because we don't have enough participants. Then we'll get together with a bunch of other sites, or maybe just a few. And so we'll develop a consortium, and then we will put all those people together. And I'll talk about a little bit more about that later, but it's just how we get to power by having enough people. And sometimes you need a consortium to get there. A meta-analysis, same thing. If you want to collect more data and increase your power of your study, and sometimes you analyze a whole bunch of different studies on the same topic. And if you can do that appropriately, it's going to be more meaningful, more publishable, and more likely that your data is going to be accepted as maybe changing the way that people manage a different disease process. Vulnerable populations. So there's lots of this that has come up over the years. One of the most important things that we do in clinical research is the protection of human subjects. Okay, so before anybody does any research, they have to take a course in protection of their population of research volunteers. And so along with that comes vulnerable populations. And of course, I added it here because children are considered vulnerable population. So are women of childbearing age. So, most of our studies includes, in pediatrics, all of our studies includes vulnerable population, which are kids. Okay, next slide, please. So again, here's some of our acronyms that we talk about, that I'll talk about in this study. The IRB is simply the Institutional Review Board. This is a body at a certain institution that you work at. So UH has an IRB, the Cleveland Clinic has an IRB, Case has an IRB, and so this is a governing board that will look at research continually and do an annual review of all the studies that they do. This is kind of like, you need to make sure that your IRB is aware of everything that happens in your research, especially if anything is not going well. If you have any what we call AEs or adverse events, or SAEs, which are serious adverse events. So if something unexpected happens to one of your participants, then the IRB needs to know about it. And there's different tiers about how you have to inform them. Sometimes you wait until the end of the year review and let them know if it's minor, but if it has anything to do with the actual research protocol, then you need to let them know right away. And of course, if there's anything like a death or something, then that's, got its own level of reporting to the IRB. If you're doing a multi-site study, then a lot of times what they're developing now is they're developing central IRBs. So all the sites will be under a certain IRB that has to be approved by your institution. And then it just makes it a little easier because then everybody is working under the same review board, basically. And so that streamlines things, and it not only makes things easier, but it makes things safer. Your PI is your principal investigator. That is usually either a physician or a PhD, depending on your research. That's the person who is solely responsible for all the conduct of everybody in the study that is doing anything on the study. So your PI is the number one person whose name is at the top of the page, and that's the person who oversees all aspects of a study. A co-investigator, excuse me, will be another physician or PhD who will be helping the primary investigator. So in some of our large studies, we'll have, a PI, like, Dr. Wood would be our PI, and then a couple other doctors will be co-investigators, and they'll help, and they'll be able to conduct study visits. They'll be able to do a lot of the stuff that the study requires. But again, the principal investigator is still responsible for the entire study. The study coordinator is basically what I've done in my almost 30-year career on many studies. And so we're typically, well, sometimes it's physicians, but typically it's nurses or dietitians or social workers. And so we do most of the recruitment. We do, we're the one who sees the patients at study visits, and we kind of do that kind of work. A regulatory coordinator is something that it's not new, but we have one, and it's just so nice to have because, like I said, your investigational review board, your IRB, is going to do an annual review on all the studies. And so, first of all, the regulatory coordinator, first of all, knows all the regulatory stuff inside and out. So that means study submission for approval. And then once it's approved, they know all the different aspects. So there's certain things that have to be done on a regular basis, like getting everybody's CVs, keeping them up to date. In research, there's also continuing education that anybody on your study has to continue with. And so the regulatory coordinator will remind people that, hey, every 3 years you have to get so many continuing education credits. And so, you're due in 3 months. So if you don't have those, you got to do them now, because once you get to those deadlines, then you can't any longer participate in any studies, really. So, so we have one regulatory coordinator who manages a lot of our studies, and he's very good at it. So, you'll get emails from him, and he'll say, "Hey, your hours are due in 6 months, or your CV needs to be updated, signed, and sent to me, so I can send it to the study and to the IRB by a certain time." So that's what the regulatory coordinator is about. The NIH is National Institutes of Health, and the FDA is the Food and Drug Administration. Those are when we're doing federal studies or government studies. Those are the regulatory agencies that conduct those studies. So the NIH is more for clinical studies that are done with interventions, and food and drug is obviously where we're trying to get different drugs approved or devices approved. So if you got a new pump, it has to be approved by the FDA, and if you have a new intervention, then you have to get it approved by the NIH. Next slide, please. So, the types of research, I said the types of research that families of children with diabetes may or will encounter. So if you have a child with diabetes, and it doesn't matter how old they are, it doesn't matter if they have type 1 or type 2, somewhere along the way, somebody is likely going to approach you and ask you if you'll be involved in a study. And sometimes, of course, studies can be incredibly simple. It's simply filling out a survey. Okay, and they're going to have so many people fill out a survey, and some studies, are involved, like the one I was talking about that I'll talk a little bit more about later. But I've been in the same study for 38 years, and so we have done so many different parameters of things that they're studying and trying to learn from. And so, that's the longest study that has ever been done in diabetes. But so they can be very simple or rather more difficult. But the clinical studies will typically involve some kind of an intervention. So that's not something where you'll just fill out a survey. That's something where you're actually going to test something. Like a drug study would be a clinical study. If you're going to have human subjects in the study and you're trying to get a drug approved, it's a clinical study. Consent will definitely be needed in a clinical trial or a clinical study, possibly assent. I'll talk a little bit about the difference in a minute. A lot of times you'll use a control group and an experimental group. So a control group will be a group that has been doing what people have been doing all along. An experimental group will involve some kind of a new intervention where they're going to want to see if general clinical practice is still pertinent to what people should be doing. Or if you do the experiment, this might be something that's better. So some examples, like I said, are a new drug or device, new therapies, or comparing different treatment modalities. Okay, Sarah, next slide. Okay, so the other type of study is an observational study. So this typically does not involve an intervention. It may or may not require consent or assent. If you want to find that out, then you go to the IRB and you ask them, do you think that we need to have, consent and assent, or can we just hand these surveys out since there won't be any identification information on them, and we just want to, you know, ask a very simple question to a group of people. So other examples of an observational a study would include chart review, tracking a former intervention study. So you did an intervention study, and now you just want to see what happens to those people in it. The intervention's over, but you kind of want to see how these people did over the period of years or months or years after it was done, or searching a database, or like a population census study. So some of those are government studies where, you know, they want to see how many people in Southern Ohio, you know, have, you know, obesity or something like that. It's best to check with the IRB to be certain if study qualifies as this type or if consent or assent is needed. Okay, next slide, please. So consent and assent. So consent is a written, now it can be electronic agreement between the research team and the research volunteers or participants to enroll in a research study. So, you know, this you know, brings up another incredibly important thing when somebody's asking you if you want to enroll in a research study. You want to, the first thing that needs to be known is you're a research participant volunteer, or that's what they're asking you to be. And it's just that, it's volunteering. So every time you do a study visit, anytime you sign another consent form to move on with the study, if it's over time, if it's longitudinal, anytime you do anything, whoever's conducting the research needs to ask you if you want to continue to volunteer in the study. If a parameter has changed, consent and assent must be redone. Annual consenting is typically done if a study lasts more than a year. If it's longitudinal, meaning it goes on for years and years, every year you usually have to sign a new consent form, even if there is no changes. A copy of what you sign needs to be provided. That's another thing, that if your IRB looks at it and they find out that people are not getting signed consent forms or assent forms, that's a huge no-no. The IRB is going to come down on those people very hard. You know, very hard meaning what? Well, I mean, sometimes it can get legal. Sometimes they'll shut down the study. Sometimes they'll shut down the investigator. And on a few rare occasions, the whole institution can be shut down because of, you know, behavior that one certain study will do. So that's how, you know, this is so serious and why people are so incredibly, you know, educated and serious about conducting study, because not only can you get in trouble, you can get your whole institution in trouble. And that's really someplace you don't want to go. And like I said, it could be legal. I mean, you know, if you're really doing something that's unethical and your IRB or the study sponsor or anybody, you know, realizes this, then people can be, you know, arrested for it. It's that serious. Volunteers, participants can relinquish agreement at any time without penalty. This must be asked at any subsequent visits, and without any penalty, meaning basically, you know, if you're in a certain medical practice and they're doing a study and somebody asks you to be in a study, or if you're in a study and you relinquish your consent or your agreement to participate, then what happens is, or what should happen is, you go right back to where you were before you signed the consent to be in the study. You go back to being a regular patient. Nobody can be mad at you. Nobody can treat you any differently. You know, again, the most important word on this page is volunteer, because any study that anybody is in, they're in as a volunteer. Okay, next slide, please. So assent is basically the consent for minors, or I didn't include this, but or vulnerable patients. So sometimes, people do studies on people who can't sign consent. Maybe they're blind, or maybe they have cognitive disabilities where they can't conceptualize what's being asked of them to do. Now, there's certain life and death events, and IRBs and institutions will have this in place where if this is the case, where somebody has to get an experimental drug and it's the only thing on earth that could possibly save their life, and they can't sign a consent form, then they can get legal involved, and they can get social workers involved and things like that, who can kind of override the non-consent. But anyhow, assent is for parents of children with diabetes or anything else who are going to verify that this is what they want to do. The assent versions change for different age children. A lot of times this will be 14 or so, and sometimes the assent in the older age group, especially for the female patients, will include different language about pregnancy and pregnancy prevention and what happens if a participant gets pregnant. Parents or guardians must sign consent and adjunct to assent. So we cannot enroll a kid in a study without their parent or guardian's consent. When a minor reaches the age of maturity, which is typically 18 years old, they re-sign the consent form. Copies of both are required to be provided. And at that time, just like, if you have kids who are over 18, even when they go to the pediatrician's office, they have to give you permission to look at their labs and to order their meds. And, 18 is the age of consent for a lot of things here in the United States. And it's also the age of consent. So your assent form will be good until your 18th birthday, and then that's null and void, and then you sign a consent form if you want to continue in the study. Assent forms are simplified versions using different language with less pages. It's a little simpler versions, kind of like the old Cliff Notes we used to use in college. An example would be, I have a study where the consent form is about 38 pages and the assent form is about 11. So, it's a very simplified version of what the consent form contains. Okay, Sarah, thank you. So we're going to talk a little bit about sponsorship and regulation, a little more detail here. Sponsor is an entity that takes full responsibility for a research study. They'll come up with the question, the hypothesis, the title. They will either have the funding or they'll find the funding and all the regulatory assignments. So some examples of sponsors would be federal sponsors like the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, the Veterans Administration. They do lots of studies at the VA, and some census population studies that the government might do. The state, so state medical, nursing, and other certification boards, and other would be industry. So that's, your studies from in this world that we're talking about is drugs. So, Rainbow right now, we're doing a study on inhaled insulin. So inhaled insulin is not approved in minors. And so Dr. Wood is doing a study, and she's got co-investigators like Dr. McLeish, and she's got a couple study coordinators like Terry Casey and I that are working on, and Wendy Campbell, we're working on that study to try to get inhaled insulin approved in minors. Local institutions like hospital systems might do their own research studies. Educational, if you're in this world that we're in, we have a very strong fellowship program. Fellows are doctors who are specializing in pediatric endocrinology. And so as part of their 3 to 5 year fellowship, they have to do a certain year of study. And so they have to come up with their own study, and then they have to get the IRB approval. They have to do everything that's done in a research study they do on their own, which gives them the background and education to do it in the future. So a lot of times, because they do clinical studies, they need to get patients. So the patients are the participants are our rainbow patients. And so a lot of times they'll have all kinds of different things. And sometimes these turn out to be really nice projects that turn into things that we use. One of our fellows did a study a couple of years ago that came up with our practice guidelines for sick day management. Another one came up with a different, it was a nutritional study, and it ended up being a magnet that you put on your refrigerator with different carbohydrate exchanges. So some of these fellowship programs are really cool. And so, they're constantly looking for people. And, there's a couple that are going on right now. So, if you're in clinic, they'll come out and, they'll meet you in the waiting room or while they're waiting for the doctor to come in, and they'll explain their project just to see what your interest might be, and then get into more detail if you want to hear more. School projects. And so, that might be at, any level. I mean, some kids do research projects in their grade schools and high schools, and then, college students do research projects as well. And the list kind of goes on and on. Next slide, please. Hey, Sarah, I'm worried that I might have a problem with my internet here.
Okay, yeah, here, I'll go back. This was the one we were just on. Here's the next one.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we were on it. I think it just looks the same.
Okay. It does look the same. I saw the response. Okay, sorry about that. My bad.
Oh, good.
Continuing. So the sponsor is the ultimate responsibility of all conduct, regardless of other roles that may be delegated by the sponsor. So again, sometimes you have, a sponsor, and then they'll kind of subcontract different parts of the study out if it's a complicated study. So they'll get a study, and then they'll find, of course, the people who are going to do it, which are typically in our world are doctors. But then they'll also have like a regulatory agency that will do the regulation. So these are companies that have like monitors that go out and go to the sites, because the sponsor doesn't have enough people to do that. And so they'll subcontract the regulatory part out to a different company. So there's companies that just do that. Includes regulation of delegated co-researchers as far as credential, education, expertise in the clinical area. So, you can't just get anybody to do these studies. For our studies, you can't just have a pediatric office. You do them. You need to have a pediatric endocrinology office that does them. And also keeping an eye on the budget. You only get so much money to do a study. And so, everything has to be under that, blanket. Monitoring of all study parameters is essential to provide optimal study integrity, and will be done as much as often as necessary. So the monitoring is very important. So a lot of the monitoring can be done remotely, but again, I have study monitors coming at all times. They come in and they want to look at your books. They want to look at all your binders with all your data. They want to make sure that your consent forms are signed appropriately by the right people in the right format, in the right ink. I mean, it can get really scrutinizing. And also, they look through the data, because nowadays, we used to do all the data capture on paper, and then you had just mountains and mountains of paper and binders, but now it's all done electronically. So they have to make sure that everything is, all the data is captured appropriately. And so the monitors will actually come to your sites and look. They also look at eligibility. So, there's certain eligibility criteria for participants to be in your study. So the monitors will make sure that, if it's a study for kids with type 1 diabetes, then they have to make sure that this kid has type 1 diabetes. So they're going to want to see the records that prove that. If they have type 2, they want to come in and make sure that they don't have type 1. Some studies, it doesn't matter, like our inhaled insulin study that we're doing now, we'll take type 1 or type 2. But a lot of the studies that we do is one or the other. The pump studies, sometimes it doesn't matter. We can put pumps on anybody. In order for the results to be finalized for release, data must be locked, all monitoring must be completed in all locations conducting the research. So again, the monitoring continues on after the study ends. So the study basically ends when the last participant in the study at all sites has their last visit, but that's not the end of the study. Then the sponsor has to make sure the regulatory people, whether they're in the institution that does the study or not, completes all the regulation, make sure that there's no errors in the data capturing and the data entering, and then they do what they call a study lock. So then they lock all the data, so none of it can be changed. And they have to be sure that everybody's happy with how it is conducted, how the data is captured, and that it's complete. And then they'll lock the data. So nothing can be published, nothing can be approved, nothing can be really done with anything until the study's completed. Everything is regulated, locked, signed, sealed, and delivered. And so sometimes when a study ends, as far as participation, the study might not actually be completely finished and ready for publication for a year or more, or sometimes a couple of years, depending on the volume of data and the number of subjects that are in it. So it can be quite daunting. And so that's what we do as researchers, is, we do a part of this. And so there's a lot of different parts, and until everybody is done with everything, can it be completely locked up. A lot of times for these studies that have, multi-sites and longitudinal, we meet on conference calls and virtually continually. Sometimes it's weekly, sometimes it's more than that. If you're on a different committee, I could have a study where I'm doing, I'm on committees, and I might have 3 or 4 conference calls a week for one study. And then typically what will happen is sometime during the year, everybody will go someplace and meet in person. And that's where we'll really kind of get into the nitty gritty. We all get to know each other, and, it can be really nice. It's also nice because then in the future, when you're doing a similar study, you kind of know people from different sites that do the same thing. And so if somebody comes up with an idea that they want to test, then they kind of have an idea of their friends they can call and say, hey, we're thinking of doing this. Do you want to join us? And so that's something that it's very useful in a lot of ways, because the networking is incredibly important. Sometimes they'll have these meetings in conjunction with other meetings like the ADA. And so we'll have meetings, the ADA is 5 days long. And so we'll actually go a day early or stay a day late, and we'll have a study meeting at the same time at the same place, so that everybody who's going to the ADA anyhow will be able to make good use of their travel time and all meet together. Okay, Sarah, thank you. So the IRBs are the governing entities that regulate research studies. They may be local or central. I already talked about that a little bit. They may determine if a topic is feasible, clinical or observational, as ultimate power to continue or discontinue a study at any time. What happens sometimes is, which is interesting, I was talking about the study that I've been in, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But what the IRB might also determine is that if the study question is answered, or if everybody is in agreement that the intervention works, they might stop the study early. And the reason for that is because if there's no reason to continue to collect data, because the proof is already in the pudding, then there's no sense in continuing to spend money and waste people's time. This is done. Let's get this done. Let's get it locked, and let's get this out there. So an IRB has the power to do that. If the IRB finds major issues of study conduct or legal implications, they report to the appropriate authorities. I already talked about that a little bit, and that chain is long and wide, and it can become very serious. Okay, next slide. So some personal experiences that I just want to kind of go over. So the DCCT edict study is the study I've been talking about a little bit, and I had my 38th year visit there. So the DCCT was the Diabetes Control and Complications Trial. EDIC is the Epidemiology of Diabetes Interventions and Complications. So basically what this study did, it started back in 1984. So this started a long, long time ago. And basically what this did is it determined and proved that if you keep your blood sugar under tight control, then that can help to alleviate long-term complications. Basically, it started off as a retinopathy study, and it spilled over into nephropathy and neuropathy. And so it randomized 1,442 participants in 27 sites. So there's your longitudinal study, multi-centered. This was the DCCT was a clinical study, okay? And it ended early. And the reason it ended early was because the NIH, who was the sponsor, and all the IRBs at all 27 institutions came to agreement that tight control was worth the effort to achieve. It seems kind of basic now, right? And like kind of like a dull moment. Well, of course it was. Well, first of all, you have to realize that 40 years ago, we didn't have the tools that we have now. Blood glucose monitoring by finger prick was in the infantile stages. So basically, when I was diagnosed with diabetes, I was still checking my urine for glucose. Okay. We used 2 or 3 different kinds of insulin. There were no insulin pumps yet. Pumps were just starting to come out then also. So we didn't have the tools to manage diabetes like we do today. And the biggest fear was hypoglycemia, because people were having low blood sugars, and they thought if we tighten up the control, they'll have more low blood sugars, and this can be more dangerous than what the high blood sugars cause over time. So the DCCT then ended, and EDIC was started. So EDIC was kind of like I said in the beginning, it was an observational study. It's been following the original DCCT cohort of participants over the past, now it's been about 31 years. So in edict, they don't manage our diabetes like they did in DCCT. Okay, so we were tasked with going out into the community, finding our own providers to manage our diabetes. There were two different parts of the cohort. There was an experimental group and a standard group. Okay, the standard group did what everybody was doing back in those days, basically taking 2 shots of insulin a day, basically checking their urine for glucose, but blood glucose monitoring was just coming out, so they were pricking their fingers maybe once or twice a day, and going to the doctor every 3 months, and following a very strict diet, and their A1Cs typically ran, at a certain level. In order to prove this, back then also A1C, or what we call glycohemoglobin back then. Glycohemoglobin was more of a look at the whole hemoglobin molecule rather than a portion of it, which what the A1C is. But that was also kind of a new phenomenon too. But back then, when we first diagnosed diabetes, we didn't have blood glucose monitors, so we went and saw what our blood sugar was once every 3 months when we went to the doctor. Now, of course, you see it every 5 minutes on your CGM. So that's how things have changed over 40 years. But so EDIC was and is a. Let me turn this off here real quick. Sorry, everybody. EDIC was a observational study. And then along with EDIC now, what we do is we do constantly, because this is the largest group of people with diabetes that have ever been studied. This is the 40th year. I got in 2 years in. That's why it says here, this is my 38th visit. And so they're constantly doing more studies, and we get carotid ultrasounds, and we get eye exams with photos that are not done in regular clinical practice. We get, today I had a fibroscan. What's a fibroscan? Well, that's an ultrasound of your liver. So now that we're all getting older, most of us are seniors now. So, a lot of people who are older, who have diabetes, are starting to get what they call non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And so they're looking at, so that's what the FibroScan does. It looks at our liver to see if we have a fatty liver. And so we do all these different parameters, then that's studied, and that's determined, whether or not diabetes is a risk and how much of a risk it is to have, for all these people who have now had diabetes for decades and decades. So as it says, the longest and most referenced study in diabetes ever conducted. It's hard to find a journal article anywhere that doesn't discuss something about DCCT EDIC. It began in 84, and is ongoing. So this summer at the ADA annual meeting, they'll have the 40th anniversary celebration for DCCT EDIC. I was randomized in 1986. And so I've been in that ever since. Obviously, the DCCT kind of changed my life because when I got diabetes, I was a house painter. I had a little painting business. Like I said in the beginning, if anybody told me I would be conducting clinical research studies at this point in my life, I would have thought you were crazy. But after a couple of years in DCCT, I just got to go to nursing school. I started working at camp, and then, now it's the rest is history. So just to, kind of talking about some of the definitions I talked about, the different studies and everything like that, DCCT kind of personifies a lot of that stuff. Okay, Sarah, next slide, please. So these are some of the studies that I've worked on over the past, just short of 30 years while I've been at Rainbow. The Today study was the treatment options for type 2 diabetes in adolescents and youth. It was 3 different phases, well, really 4 with the genetic study that went along with it. So we had the Today study, the Today 2 phase 1 study, the Today 2 phase 2 study, and genetics. Genetics was where we got a bunch of non-study participants, and we did some extra studies on these kids who would have been eligible for the Today study after we were finished with recruitment. Today was just kind of like DCCT. It was actually modeled a lot after DCCT. A lot of the investigators and PIs were DCCT investigators and PIs. Same with at Rainbow. Dr. Doms did DCCT at Rainbow, and he was our first principal investigator of the Today study at Rainbow. So Today was clinical. So we treated our participants. We treated their diabetes for a good many of years. And then we went to observational, where again, they went out in the community, got their own health care, but we monitored them. So it went from a clinical study to observational. We did that for 17 years. We published over 60 manuscripts, and it was multi-centered, 15 sites, and longitudinal 17 years. So I was the local study coordinator of Today and the national coordinator chair from the beginning to the end. Okay, Sarah, next slide. So some other studies I've worked on, these are just listed. So some type 1 studies. I did the metformin in overweight children with type 1, racial differences in mean CGM glucose. The African American Diabetes Intervention Project. I just worked on Protect, which was teplizumab, which is just got approved recently. This is a anoclonal antibody that prevents the onset of type 1 diabetes, or if somebody has type 1 diabetes, it kind of enhances their honeymoon period. Working on Afrezza, which is the inhaled inhaled insulin study. We're starting a new study called Go Team. That's an NIH study that we just got, that Dr. McLeish just got a grant for. CASE-CAN was a study that I helped Dr. McLeish get at the Great Lakes Science Center. We did a study with some high school students, kidney injury and DKA. That's another local study that one of our doctors did at Rainbow over the last couple of years. And the diabetes prevention trial, that was the precursor to TrialNet. We've worked on TrialNet as too. I didn't even include that, but the TrialNet is ongoing. That's where we're looking at antibodies for kids, for first-degree family members of people with type 1 diabetes, to try to get them into other studies to see if we can prevent diabetes. The diabetes prevention trial was the precursor to TrialNet, and I worked on that when I first came to Rainbow 28 years ago with Dr. Doms. In that study, what we did is we gave people with positive antibodies insulin to see if they would, if we would divert the diagnosis of type 1 diabetes. Long and short of it, it didn't work. So now there's other studies going on with things like teplizumab, but insulin didn't work to prevent diabetes in people who didn't have diabetes, but had the makeup of diabetes because they had positive antibodies. Type 2 studies, other than Today, we did metformin in children. So metformin was the only oral medication approved in children up until about a year and a half ago. So I worked on the original study about 30 years ago to get it approved. And that was the only thing other than insulin approved in kids with type 2. Dynamo, linagliptin, those are some studies that we did recently to get other medications approved for type 2 kids. And Intent is a study I'm working on now with the Division of Psychiatry at Rainbow, doing some we're doing some different kinds of interventions with mind, body, and meditation and things like that. So we're trying to treat depression along with type 2 diabetes to see if we can kind of help lower the burden of diabetes by treating depression along with it. Some other studies I've done with other disease processes. I did a study with kids with Prader-Willi syndrome, and I've also done some studies for kids with cystic fibrosis. So I think that's about it. I don't know if anybody has any questions. I know it's a lot of stuff. I try to keep it simple. You know, again, you know, if you're a parent or a child with either type 1 or type 2 diabetes, I would be shocked if somebody didn't at some point in time come along and ask you to participate in some kind of a research study. Just real quick, you know, we've talked a lot about doing research at camp, and so it gets a little bit wonky sometimes. And again, I've been at camp for over 30 years. We've talked about this many times. And, you know, but looking at my slides now, you can kind of understand a little bit. First of all, camp does not have an IRB. And so, you know, you have to be really careful if you don't have an IRB, because that's the overseeing board that will make sure that everything's being done safe and effective and legally and appropriately. So, you know, I always kind of had the opinion that if we don't have an IRB at camp, we really shouldn't conduct research studies at camp. But sometimes people will have research studies and will use camp as a recruitment tool. And as far as that's concerned, yes, we do that. And yeah, if the investigators want to do that, that's perfectly fine, because then they're taking on the responsibility, and that's fine. But having research studies run through camp as the sponsor, you know, that's really kind of putting up more risk, I think, than it's worth. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Paul. That was great. Very informative, and I think I definitely learned a lot about what goes into it. I've heard the things kind of thrown around before. I've seen it written down, but now I've got a little bit better understanding of what goes into it. Seems like a lot of hard work, sometimes a lot of red tape that may hold you back from time to time, but really good stuff, and definitely would love to see something happen at camp in the future. That would be fantastic. I think that would really add some credibility to the program and be just a fantastic testing site for, or research site for, students and professors and things like that. Yeah,
basically you'd have to get somebody to run that was very credentialed and very knowledgeable.
Yeah, we've been looking into it, and we've had some grant opportunities that have come up where we would be looking to approach Case Western or someone else to say, would you go in on this with us?
Yeah, that would work.
So this would be beginning to come across our table. We've never really been set in a place to kind of move forward with it, but this has been helpful, so we have a better understanding of what goes into it and kind of what needs to happen to bring it together.
Yep.
Yeah, great. Sarah, we could stop the recording now, I suppose.